this morning. If you're expecting to see Nikki chairing today, she might well be on the list of attendees, but she's got a nasty cold, so couldn't talk to welcome everybody. So I'm standing in for her. I think everybody does know me. I'm Chris Cheffings. I'm one of the two team leaders at JNCC for the ecosystem analysis team. So UK TEPoP is the Terrestrial Evidence Partnership of Partnerships. Hopefully you all know that. It currently includes 18 UK organisations who work in terrestrial monitoring and who engage with volunteer recorders. TEPoP encourages working together to collaborate, exchange knowledge, and to problem solve together. So I should say I can see recording has actually started. We are recording the event except for the breakout groups, and all of the presentations will be available to view on the JNCC YouTube channel after the event. And the earlier events from this year's TEPoP Festival are already available on that YouTube channel. So Izzy, if you move on to the next slide, I think. Yeah, so every year TEPoP has a conference. Since the pandemic, it's been a series of online webinars, and yeah, this year we're calling it a festival. And they exist so that we can collaboratively explore various topics of interest. We're sadly coming to the end of this year's festival, with the final event on developing indicators coming up in a couple of weeks. So yeah, I'm sure my team are going to enjoy not having to organise more workshops, but they are always very enjoyable, and we do look forward to them every year. So if you wish to find out any more details on joining the final event on the 2nd of November, talking about developing indicators, then please do contact the TEPoP mailbox. The work we're going to be discussing today, habitat recording, it's really been in the mix of thinking in TEPoP right from the start. So we had a focused workshop on habitat recording back in 2018. It's of huge importance that we talk about this together as Earth observation becomes more and more powerful, more satellites are launched, there's higher resolutions, satellite imagery becoming available more easily. So it's really important that we join up our thinking about how citizen science can use Earth observation data and how Earth observation workers can use citizen science data. You know, kind of a message of we're more powerful together, and thinking about how those data sources can really complement each other well, and yeah, be used to help take forward the important conservation work that we all care about. So if we move on to the next slide, Izzy. Right, so this morning we are going to have 3 presentations. None of them are going to last terribly long, so we're going to be moving quickly. First, we're going to hear from Ailey Barnes from BTO, talking about their recent work evaluating the potential for recording additional information within our volunteer-based schemes. Then Izzy herself, who's also managing to control all the slides, is going to talk about our current work within the terrestrial surveillance development and analysis project, looking at the potential for volunteers to record further habitat information. And then Richard Lucas from Aberystwyth University is going to talk about his Earth Track app as a case study for collecting habitat information using citizen science. Then we're going to have a quick break, get a cup of tea. We'll come back into the main session first off, and then we'll go into breakout groups to discuss the various options that exist for integrating habitat recording into our schemes, and also the important volunteer feedback mechanisms. And then to close off this morning, we'll all reconvene back in this main meeting to think about next steps. And if you're all panicking that you haven't had any breakout room invites, Izzy will be sending those through a bit later. Right, so I'm on time. So my main job today, I think, is going to be keeping us all on time. So I'd better not drift myself. And so we are going to start into our main agenda now. And I'd like to introduce Ailey Barnes, who is a research ecologist at BTO. She's working on a range of projects to understand changes in populations of birds. And she is going to be presenting a TSDA project that looked to develop a framework to assess whether volunteers are suitable, whether that's a suitable mechanism for recording additional data on habitats in the field. So I guess, Ailey, you're going to share your screen.
Thank you for inviting me to talk. So Rob, Michael and I, so Michael at CEH and Rob Robinson and myself at BTO, as part of TSDA, we're asked to assess the feasibility of volunteers from different schemes to record habitat, as Chris has just told you. So however, we quickly realised that this wasn't straightforward, and there was no one-size-fits-all solution, as there were certain questions and things to think about. So we've come up with a framework to help organisers identify issues they need to consider. If it's going to move, oh crumbs. Okay, so firstly I want to address what we mean by habitat. So habitat is defined as the place in which an organism lives, characterised by physical features or by dominant plant types, and is therefore scale dependent on the taxa of interest, which will differ in response to habitat. For example, birds are interested in whether the woodland is broad-leaved or not, whereas the caterpillar, in which the bird might prey on, are more dependent on the types of individual trees. Furthermore, the complexity of habitat recording for our volunteers and recorders is depicted in these two pictures. They're taken from the same viewpoint, so depending on what the recorder deems as important habitat or what they're asked to report on, could be, as in picture 1, could be my laser pointer isn't working. There we go. Could be a birch scrubland with some bracken. Could be depicted as a birch woodland or open woodland. But in picture 2, could be more of an agricultural area with some broken trees and possibly even in an upland setting. So in order to address these complexities and investigate whether volunteers could record habitat, we came up with this framework comprising these 6 questions that need to be answered before implementing habitat recording. Of course, although we're talking about habitat recording, these questions in the framework could apply to any other additional information or recording we may ask of volunteers. The first question is, how clear is a question provided to the volunteers? So why record habitat? Well, habitat is already used in a number of ways, and what is collected and how it is used depends on the question to be addressed by the scheme. So questions related to biodiversity are interested in monitoring habitat extent, or condition or quality. So what makes a good habitat will depend on the species in question. Habitat associations by particular species, understanding how habitat causes population changes or habitat-related environmental drivers, and to enable stratified sampling strategies to allow greater representativeness and less biased measures of environmental or biodiversity change. So most of our volunteers are biodiversity recorders, so any additional recording, such as validating Earth observation data, would need to align with their motivations or require new or different volunteers. In order to align with volunteer motivation, the questions supplied must be clear, and important to that volunteer. For example, our experience suggests if you wanted volunteers to collect habitat data for bird monitoring, they'll be more inclined to oblige if this is clearly stated. However, if the level of additional recording is relevant to, say, only centipedes, for instance, bird recorders may be less interested, and equally, if they don't understand why they're required to collect it, or if it's of little interest to them, i.e. Earth observation. Evidence from the Breeding Bird Survey scheme shows that volunteers over time became less motivated to collect habitat data, as shown by the increase in these green bars, which represent the number of survey squares with no habitat data recorded, until level 1 category habitat recording was made compulsory in 2014. Volunteer motivations could result from a lack of confidence to ID other taxa, or for example, what improved grassland actually looks like. Continuous engagement and training with volunteers would enhance and promote the continued collection of habitat data if they knew what it was being used for. So this leads nicely on to question 3, and how have volunteers been engaged? The recent work by Michael and colleagues at the UKCEH, along with social scientists on the DECIDE project, have found that motivation to record any additional data is linked to trust. Volunteers are more likely to carry out a task if asked by an organisation that they trust. But this will require additional engagement and be linked to the previous and subsequent questions in the framework of their motivations and interests, and be proportional to how far outside their normal recording routine. Engagement can occur at 4 stages of the project. As the survey is being conceived and designed, however, this may be less feasible in randomly stratified sampling. During the recruitment phase, volunteers could be asked what they'd like or what they can record. For example, are they okay recording specific crop types, or would they prefer just to say whether it was grass or arable? While it's been operated, and after it, or after the recorder's participation has ended. Engagement during the lifetime of this lifetime of the project is particularly important, increasing not only willingness to participate and data quality, but also increasing the participants' knowledge and engagement with the underlying issues. Biodiversity volunteers might do EO validation or Earth observation validation, but we need to be engaged in the right way, be provided with ongoing support, and be persuaded of its value. Providing good feedback is also important, especially if you want volunteers to do multiple visits, i.e. to record, or for example, to record change over time. So question number 4 is how much additional effort is required. Volunteers are contributing to surveys with little or no direct compensation, beyond the extent to which they gain personal satisfaction or knowledge from participating. Thus, any additional effort, especially where it is targeted at different activities from the core survey, has the potential to reduce satisfaction or participation. Additional recording should therefore require minimum extra effort, or where extra effort is required, sufficient justification and motivation should be provided to compensate. So question number 5 is, what is the scale of sampling? So this photo represents a complex visual scene. So imagine you're standing here where the photographer is, or the recorder. Your immediate habitat is this sort of unenclosed, is it maybe bracken, maybe some heather, upland habitat. But if you look further afield, it becomes more agriculture with fragmented woodland, and further again, it's in an upland setting with some built-up areas bordering a loch. So as mentioned, this depends on what is important for the taxon being recorded, or preconceptions of the surveyor, since certain features might be deemed more important or be more visible than the broader habitat within which they occur, requiring clear guidance on what information should be recorded. Additionally, recording is likely to be easier where it involves recording at the point or on the route of the existing survey. Wider habitat metrics might provide more context, but likely require higher effort and so a greater investment in engagement, leading back to question 3 in the framework. So last but not least, question number 6 is, how complex is the protocol? Well, here is 3 examples of how we currently record habitat in some of the schemes. So BBS uses CRIC 1992, the National Parrot Monitoring Scheme uses its own classification, and UK BMS, or UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme, uses UNIS. All 3 have different levels of categorisation, with the top levels, level 1 here bold, being broadly similar, but capture different information in the lower and more detailed levels. For example, BBS reports on management and land uses and key details such as the presence of deadwood or the presence of livestock, whereas the National Plant Monitoring Scheme is more focused on specific plant species, and UK BMS focuses on soil and overall vegetation class. Each captures something important and to the scale of the taxa that the scheme is recording. Broad level 1 categories may be easily reproduced on a mobile app or a simple pop-up asking, "Are you in woodland?" Whereas a long list of options could become confusing and volunteers may be more likely to not engage or be motivated to continue. So to summarise the framework, you need to consider these 6 questions. It doesn't matter if you're recruiting new volunteers or adding additional recording into existing volunteer schemes. At the end of the day, participants are all volunteers, so you have to be responsive to their motivations. It's not necessarily just about scientific questions, but we have to think equally about the science and the volunteers' ability to partake.
Thank you very much, Ailey. That was a great overview, thinking about the kind of questions that we all need to be highly aware of when we're designing volunteer schemes. So I'm going to push on. There is going to be a chance for questions after the 3 presentations. So hold those thoughts right now. And also just to highlight, Izzy has sent out the breakout groups now. And if you haven't had an email from Izzy, can you put that in the chat? She won't be able to get back to you while she's presenting right now, but she will do at some point. Okay, so we're now going to hear from Izzy, who is one of the analysts in my team. She did a great piece of work a year or so back, looking at the uses of biological recording data in by the country nature conservation bodies and by government. She's also heavily involved in a lot of our Earth observation work and how that can be presented in meaningful ways. So Izzy, over to you.
Brilliant, thanks Chris. I'm hoping you can see my screen.
We can, Izzy, that's fine, yeah.
Brilliant. And I'm hoping you can't hear any drilling because, of course, there's some kind of roadwork going on right now. So fingers crossed that doesn't come through. But yes, thanks ever so much, everyone, for joining this morning. As Chris said, my name's Izzy Hassel. I'm Ecosystem Analyst at JNCC. I'll be talking to you today about a piece of work we've been doing under the Terrestrial Surveillance Development and Analysis project, looking to evaluate the potential to collect further habitat information through volunteer recording schemes. So previous work in this area, as Ailey's already covered, has been a fantastic starting point for scoping habitat recording and how this can be integrated with citizen science. So keeping in mind BTO's framework for understanding whether volunteers would be suitable to collect additional data, we wanted to define a really clear aim. So we focused this TSDA project on evaluating the potential for volunteer networks to collect habitat information for Earth observation applications. So we've been discussing EO requirements with experts to understand what would need to be recorded for use in Earth observation applications, summarising the current picture of habitat recording in TEPoP schemes already. So that was using some information collected by BTO. And we've also proposed several different data collection pathways, and we've been looking into existing habitat recording app capabilities to scope those out. So the first draft of the report associated with this project was sent around last week. This is very much a live document and we'll be revisiting it following this workshop. And the aim of today was to hopefully get some reactions on habitat recording and the proposed data collection effort. So hopefully we can get some next steps and some ideas to incorporate into the reports. So traditional use of in situ habitat data within Earth observation has been to train and validate habitat extent maps. So national scale maps are currently produced using Sentinel 10-meter resolution data, among other sources. And also high resolution data makes it possible to generate local high-res maps as well. So habitat extent maps inform policy decisions across the UK. So things like nature recovery networks and similar policies are made possible on a national scale using these maps, but they also contribute heavily to local site management as well. And recent Earth observation developments can facilitate more complex analyses. So things like regular updates to habitat extent maps are made possible by continuous satellite imagery acquisition. Producing annual maps allows us to assess changes in habitat extent or condition over time, and field data really helps to validate these observed changes. So checking, is that observed change an actual change on the ground, or is it just an outlier in the data? And they also help, in situ data also really helps us to interpret possible drivers of change as well. So ongoing work at Aberystwyth University to develop a habitat-based taxonomy of change will help us to predict drivers of change using EO data in future. It's really important to note that it isn't just about habitat extent in Earth observation. As a range of sensors expands and the spatial and temporal resolution increases, we have condition assessments are made possible and more complex analyses. So things like evidence of pest or pathogen damage, spread of invasive species, or nutrient enrichment and vegetation moisture content, just as a couple of examples. For example, monitoring peatland has become a major priority across the UK in order that we progress towards national conservation targets. And we can map degraded peat using satellite imagery and monitor change in condition. And that helps us to assess the effectiveness of any restoration or management strategies. We can also use Earth observation data to plan and evaluate management activities. So, looking at things like agri-environment scheme success or specific regimes such as moor and burn regimes, for example. And continuous monitoring of our management activities helps facilitate adaptive management and effective resource use. We can also look to monitor events, so phenological changes over time, for example, and also more discrete events, so things like pollutant events or effluent plumes, as well as algal blooms as well. And there are lots more complex things you can do with this observation data. So things like soil moisture is a growing area of research. I'm not going to go into much detail about those because that requires very complex field data that's out of the scope of citizen science, really. So it's important to understand what we mean by habitat data. So a classification of habitat type, for example, upland heathland or deciduous woodland, helps us to map habitat extent. But there's also a lot more detailed information, as I've mentioned, in terms of habitat condition. So things like presence or absence of indicator species or indicators of condition, things like bare peat, for example, and also information on habitat features, so things like presence of deadwood or sward heights or canopy structure. And that helps us, this information helps us to facilitate more complex analyses of EO data. So linking back to the BTO framework in terms of how much additional effort is required of volunteers or how complex the protocol would be, it's really important to keep, we feel it's important to keep the additional information as simple as possible and make sure that volunteers have all the training and resources and support that required to make them feel comfortable in recording additional features such as habitat. So we wanted to assess the minimum amount of additional information that volunteers could realistically collect that would be really useful for Earth observation. So as a minimum requirement for Earth observation, we need a GPS location, a habitat classification estimate, and a date. And then any metadata, so things like collection protocols, would also be really useful. There are many additional features, so things like presence absence of bare peat, species composition, indicator species, evidence of pollution, and also of more vegetation characteristics, so about structural vegetation structure or canopy height, that would have then these additional information would help us to build our understanding of habitat productivity and diversity, as well as the provision of services offered by that habitat. And while this kind of information is more complicated to record, features may actually be far more interesting for volunteers to record. Specific features are more important or relevant when thinking about species, for example. So there's a trade-off between what we can reasonably ask volunteers to record and the detail that we're able to gather. I think the main point that I'd like to just draw attention to is that Earth observation experts have made it abundantly clear that they the ultimate aim is to use any data available, so they can translate between classification systems. They're just keen to use all in situ data available to better analyze the EO data. So habitat data, as Ailey has already mentioned, is collected across TEPoP schemes already. So this summary table just kind of shows what is collected through the different schemes already. But you'll notice that it does vary according to different classification systems, and habitat information is also collected with different frequencies. So some record habitat with every record, so NPMS, for example, or the UK Pollinator Monitoring Scheme. Others record annually, so the Breeding Birds Survey, and some schemes only record habitat once a site is being established. So these data are already in use in Earth observation applications. So NPMS data, for example, has been used widely to train and validate national maps, and also helping to provide interpretation of any drivers of change as well. However, a more standardized approach could really help to harness the power of these data and ensure all available data are being used as much as possible. So unifying it and extending the scope of habitat recording across TEPoP to gather information that's readily applicable to EO is definitely worth exploring. And the volunteers are already at locations surveying taxa of interest. There's already that established network of really knowledgeable volunteers. So there seems to be a real opportunity to align Earth observation and citizen science aims. However, there has been anecdotal evidence that suggests volunteers may not enjoy recording habitat and may have limited confidence in classifying habitats consistently. So volunteers may be more interested and more comfortable recording things like habitat features. So that will depend on the volunteer's personal preference and the scheme interest as well. It's really important to clearly justify the reason behind recording habitat information so volunteers fully understand where their data are being used. So in order to maximise the uptake of additional recording, we need to think about how well does collecting additional habitat information align with volunteer motivations. So again, this links back to the BTO framework that Ailey mentioned earlier. So if we think about it as expanding the volume and coverage of data collected, that will really improve the accuracy of habitat maps and assessments and improve our understanding of habitat extent, condition, connectivity, etc. And also the ability to regularly generate these estimates will help us to assess changes over time and link to possible drivers of change. It's also really important to communicate that habitat data are not simply to validate Earth observation maps. Data are available for non-EO based analyses, so things like generation of biodiversity indicators or habitat-specific indicators, or species data analysis as well. So the data are incredibly valuable in their own right. So improving our understanding of habitat helps us to better manage our local sites, and that will link to local community interest. This understanding also helps to inform national policy, so flagging areas that are suitable for regeneration efforts, for example, or doing some vulnerability mapping. And as I've mentioned, this understanding helps us to monitor management efforts and assess effectiveness of different strategies. Also importantly, improved habitat understanding will improve our understanding of species dynamics as well. We'll be able to have things like more accurate estimates of area of available habitat, improved species modelling or predictive species modelling, validating species records, but also just understanding that link between species and habitat and any kind of species reactions to different landscapes. Ultimately, we'll be able to progress towards our national and international policy goals through bettering our understanding and ultimately better protect our wildlife and natural assets through our improved understanding of habitat. So I'd just like to touch on different methods of actually collecting these data. So I thought it was important to scope out the capabilities of recording apps as they're becoming ever more popular and have, throughout citizen science recording. So species recording apps, including iRecord and iNaturalist, are both incredibly widely used, and there are taxa-specific apps, as I'm sure you're more than aware, so things like BirdTrack, Mammal Mapper, Whale Track, and the Lichen app, for just a couple of examples. We've also then got apps that collect specific field data. So things like the Bloom in Algae project has gathered some really valuable data on blue-green algal blooms. We've got the Long Forest app, for example, that surveys hedgerows across Wales. And we've also got another one called Dynamic Dunescapes, which monitors dune ecosystem health. So that's just a couple of examples across the UK. We were also looking at habitat recording apps as that is an area of development at the moment. Many allow the user to adapt survey forms to meet project-specific requirements. So for example, Esri's ArcGIS field maps allows users to collect and edit data in the field using a live interactive map. Survey 123 is another ArcGIS product, and that's a form-based system, so that allows users to collect specific information tailored to a project. And similarly, Input is the QGIS answer to that, so it's freely available and allows users to edit forms and gather required information. eSurvey is another important one to flag, and that's tailored to CEH's Assist project, and that allows farmers and landowners to monitor species composition on their land. And finally, EarthTrack, which has been developed by Aberystwyth University in order to collect habitat information for EO using citizen science, is a fantastic example of how these apps can be used to realise the potential of volunteer recording in situ data. And Richard Lucas will cover some more on that later on. So there's many possible data collection pathways available, and what we wanted to do first off was present an overview of different options for how we could integrate habitat recording into current schemes. So some of these options are definitely more feasible than others, but we wanted to gather views on each approach, and these will be the topic of one of the discussion sessions later, as Chris mentioned. So these options that we're going to present now are almost along a continuum of how integrated they are with current schemes, how integrated habitat recording is with current schemes. So the first few options are are highly integrated, so require some infrastructure change or changes to survey protocols, and while the end options are far more separate. For example, we could adopt a "is this still the case" approach. So we could have pop-up messages in apps or additional data entry in forms that ask volunteers to confirm a predicted habitat at a location. We ask volunteers to submit photographs for central analysis to classify habitats. We could also adapt protocols to record habitat against a standardized classification system. So that will involve changing the classification system, but schemes could also continue to record habitat at the same frequency as they do now. We could explicitly add an additional data entry, so to collect things, as I mentioned, as the bare minimum for Earth observation, the GPS location, and a habitat category against a standardized scheme. We could direct volunteers already using an app to a separate app, and hopefully it would be possible to autofill the app with metadata or location from the existing scheme record, and that would hopefully limit some duplication of effort there. However, that does require quite a lot of infrastructural change. So another option is just to simply direct volunteers to a separate app upon submission of their existing records. Finally, we could have habitat data collection completely separate from existing schemes by establishing a habitat recording initiative and publicising through existing scheme channels. So another consideration is how best to engage volunteers in recording additional habitat information. It's widely acknowledged that volunteers really benefit from seeing how their data are used. It's really important to communicate exactly what the data are used for and celebrate the accomplishments made possible by these data. So providing interesting feedback is especially important in encouraging additional habitat recording, as this is quite a new area for many people. So this links back to the BTO framework in terms of how have the volunteers been engaged, and it is the rationale for collecting new metrics clear. So we really want to understand what has worked well in current schemes when it comes to feedback, be that annual reports or social media posts or data access. We'd also need to think about what volunteers would be most interested in or motivated by for habitat specifically. As part of this scoping work, we've identified some options of feedback mechanisms, and I've grouped them into 6 main themes here. So the first being access to raw data, so the actual in situ data points collected by volunteers. People may be interested in that for their own interest or their own analysis. We could also provide access to Earth observation products, so either via interactive platforms or data download if people want to, and that will allow users to view habitat or condition maps, for example. We'd also could look at celebrating individual achievement, so messages such as you've submitted 50 points this year, or kind of celebrating that individual contribution. And we could also tap into a competitive element of recording by gamification of the initiatives. So things like collecting points or coins or gems and kind of going down the leaderboard route of engaging volunteers. And then we've got the more traditional options, so annual reports, so for example, annual progress of Earth observation products, the areas mapped or the analyses enabled by the data collected, or more specific reports that would be tailored to a species of interest, for example, or a local area of interest. We'll be discussing these ideas in the breakout sessions later on, so hopefully we'll get some good comments on these. It would be great to understand what we think volunteers might be most interested in. So in conclusion, this initial scoping has found that there's significant potential to collect further habitat information through citizen science. It's really important to raise awareness of the applications of the data, communicating that data pathway, and exactly how data are to be used and why. Volunteer perceptions are, it would be fantastic to capture to better understand their motivations or any kind of initial attitudes to habitat recording and identify any barriers that may exist. So engaging volunteers throughout the process is really important to make sure everyone feels involved throughout. As I mentioned, we're going to incorporate the outcomes of the workshop and any comments into the draft report and reshare, and we're hoping to engage with volunteers directly to better understand how we could collect further habitat information and understand what training and support needs to be in place. And I'll finish just by saying that these data are completely invaluable in training and validating Earth observation models, but also in their own right to look at things like species population trends and interpreting changes in habitat condition. And ultimately, our improved understanding through data collection will help us to better manage our natural resources and better conserve our wildlife. So that's everything from me. Thanks, Chris. I shall hand back over to you.
Thank you very much, Izzy. I'm very impressed. We're all running to time very well this morning. So next up this morning, we're going to hear from Professor Richard Lucas from Aberystwyth. He's going to be talking about EarthTrack. And he is a professor in the Earth Observation and Ecosystem Dynamics Research Group. And he's currently leading the Living Whales project, developing national land cover maps using Earth observation data. So over to you, Richard. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You can see the screen okay, no problem at all?
Yeah,
Fantastic.
That's fine.
Yeah, so welcome to this part of the session. I'll be talking about EarthTrack, which is a mobile app developed quite a long time ago, but it's been progressively developed in the Living Whales project, which is generating land cover and change map for Wales, but also other countries. So it's linking ground and remote observation land cover and habitats, change and biodiversity. So Living Whales is sort of almost like it's called Living Earth in effect, because we're applying it through to countries like Australia. It's developed in Europe as well. So one of the visions I have on that is to, information on our changing landscape is made available to support conservation, restoration, sustainable use of the world's environment and ecosystems. And in fact, the mission is like Earth observation data used to their maximum to support positive decisions on our future landscapes. And people have the capacity to play a role, however small, in shaping, the future for people and nature. So the EarthTrack mobile application was originally developed in the Open Data Kit. It's built on work we were doing in Queensland in Australia with the Queensland government, and it's been progressively developed through into Wales as well. So the aim is to provide ground truth information that can support the local to global classification of land cover, habitats and change, primarily from Earth observation data. As I say, it's to encourage positive action on the environment through community engagement. And we developed the app, I say, with OpenDataKit, and so far it's a globally applicable app, and we have 4,500 points available now worldwide, and there's 349 in the UK. All the data are open accessible through the Living Whales and EarthTrack portals, and it's been developed into a professional version as well. What it does, it records land cover according to the Food and Agricultural Land Cover Classification System. An example here is open, the canopy covers there, the height, the broadleaf deciduous trees, plus there's other information on the land cover as well. And there's photographs provided on that. We're developing this now to a professional version with natural aptitude, and so that will be, so it's available for Android and for iOS, and we're just in this process of design of transitioning that, the original into this new version. The components of EarthTrack for Wales are land cover, and is according to the FAO LCCS, which is a globally applicable and fully scalable land cover taxonomy in space and time. We describe the land cover, but then if we have a broadleaf forest, then we would like to know the species. So trees are important and it's manageable. Non-trees, herbaceous vegetation, we also look at certain species there. And then we want to look then at change. So recording change, and we define this on the basis of impacts and pressures, which is according to the driver's pressure states impact and response framework. So I'll explain that in a minute. And then there is the module then, which we're putting in as fire, as an example of what could be developed for other places as well. And we are developing in conjunction with Australia, but also with a view to expanding into other places as well. So I'll go through these each in turn. So the land cover part it's very modular. So it's based on the FAO LCCS, which is developed by the United Nations. It translates, is the best one in terms of land cover, into habitat classes. So you can translate quite a lot of those straight into there because of the hierarchical and modular structure of the system. And also its use of environmental descriptors like canopy cover, water depth, and so on. So you can put any range of descriptors into there to also to further describe those classes. And we have the base, this is almost like the Undercoat Classes. All the maps are available on walesliving-earth.online. So these Undercoat Classes are your broad categories defined by the FAO. So if you go into sort of semi-natural, terrestrial, woody vegetation, for example, you can go get a lot more information as well. So those maps are provided online, and what the idea behind that is it provides a connection between what's on the ground and what we map from space. So if you observe canopy cover on the ground, we map it from space, and so every time somebody clicks a point, they're helping to confirm that our land cover, the different components of the land cover class. So that's really quite nice. So the maps, we released the 2020 last week at a Eurosite meeting, and so there's 27, 2018, 2019, 2020. They're 10-meter resolution. They're from Sentinel-1 and Sentinel-2 optical and radar. And we've also worked on continental maps for Australia. So that's why the validation of the EarthTrack is applicable to both countries as a guide. Now you see the Australian map just in the top right-hand corner. It's the same leg for both countries. The maps are not, you're not classifying everything at the same time. What you're doing is you're classifying different components. So this is your undercoat. This is your, we then say, this is woody herbaceous. This is the leaf type, the dominant genus or broad categories there. Crop types, canopy cover. You can put in anything you want, water turbidity and so on. And so what we try to do is retrieve those from satellite, then validate those on the ground through citizen science or sets and networks or whatever, and then they feed in collectively into this Living Earth system, which allows the automated classification over time. We're doing annual at the moment, but we will be looking at sub-annual as well, because it has that capacity and at different resolutions. Tree species are they're important for cultivated management of the semi-natural land cover, the FAO LCCS, and they're important for many applications, including forestry ecology, carbon cycle sciences, so on. The species list differs by country, region, or continent, but the list of UK species is manageable, so it can go into the app straight away. So we can do it, right across the UK on that one. But when we come to Australia, there's still 700 species of eucalyptus, so we've got to be selective, and also other countries. So stands in the UK are often dominated by a few species, allowing discrimination from Earth observation data. So if we can collect species information, we can start to build a pattern of trying to map and discriminate species routinely across Wales and other places. The third component is the woody non-tree and herbaceous species, and this is key for translating land cover to habitats. Now, there's not one-to-one, sometimes you can't do it, but what you do is you need to have the dominant, co-dominant indicator species or genus recorded. So, for example, if we do herbaceous and it's forbs, then we would then say we need bracken to say it's bracken, and so here you can see the two types of bracken are here. The selection of species varies depending on the habitat taxonomy, which has been shown varies quite a lot. You need the dominant, co-dominant, and the indicator really to sort of fulfill that translation, but just for general interest anyway. You know, you might find certain bird species, you know, are found in New Forest, for example. But sometimes you require the context. You need to reference to existing terms like fens or bogs. So, for example, in this case, you've got heath here. So you might be able to map, you know, the heather and so on, but heather can occur in many habitats. And so there is this requirement to sort of have a bit more information, and that is something that we're considering in the new design of the app. So feedback we welcome on that one as well. The land cover and habitat change is based on impacts, which is evidenced by state changes. And what I mean by state changes is basically canopy cover is a state, crop type is a state. You have continuous and categorical states, and you can combine those to give evidence of change. So, for example, here we have a drought in the Cambrian Mountains. You can see that, you know, you've got a reduction in productivity. The amount of non-photosynthetic or dead material has gone up, it's increased, and so that all indicates that the impact and effect of the biomass of the grass might be low. But our pressures are the reason for that impact, and they are basically abiotic, biotic, or human influence. So abiotic would be, say, climate change. Biotic might be invasive species. Human influence might be, you know, clear felling of forests, for example, in Australia. So what you can then do is you can see the pressures often from, you know, from climate records, from citizen science observations of pathogens, and so on. What we do uniquely is we've got a glossary which is going to be published with the JNCC on this as well. And it's a glossary explains about there's about 70, 80 impact terms and about 150 pressure terms. But if we combine the two together, we get impacts and pressures. This is the idea for the app. So we have the impact like dieback, and the pressure could be, you know, insect damage, it could be drought, it could be anything like that. So that combination allows you a lot of flexibility, and the glossary explains exactly what it will mean. So it captures the causes and consequences. We can map it automatically. We're progressively going through these through the next year from satellites as well, because we can get, you know, we have our state changes, we have our pressures, and we can do that. We also note that time is a key consideration. So drought might take place over a season, where flash flood is an hour, and so on. So there's lots of elements of time which we bring as the evidence for our impacts and also our pressures. And we can also describe temporary land cover changes. So if it's a flood, it's a field one day, it becomes water the next. And so when you're recording on the ground, it could be, you know, it depends on when you're there. So the impact pressure combination allows you to compensate for that as well. It's very easy to understand also. The modules, the capacity to record additional information. So we encourage, you know, encouraging recording of land cover and change alongside other measures. So if you're a fisherman, you go routinely to go fishing, then you can record land cover and say record, you know, what fish you're catching. But the idea here is to have fire. So we're having fires initial demonstration of a module within EarthTrack. And that means an expansion capacity for other modules in there, and the focus is on global applicability. So our fire app has been developed with Wales and Australia, so that the same app would apply effectively globally, at least in those countries, and review other apps as well. And it does allow specialist use for different applications potentially into the future. So, you know, plowed field, it could be like, you know, water quality or whatever in there. So that expansion capacity is there. It's not meant to overtake things like biodiversity recording apps, like, you know, iNaturalist, anything like that. They, in a way, it's almost should be recorded alongside it. That's the current view of it, and it helps to inform. So you can come out of this app and maybe go into another one and record things at the same time if you want to. The access, there's an EarthTrack Geo portal, which we're developing a natural aptitude to give you open access to the EarthTrack points. They're all available. They're there within minutes of collection. They're live and so on. And the EarthTrack mobile app is also available now, but we're translating this to this professional version for use on the Android and iOS by natural aptitude. We also have this Living Wales Training and Exhibition Centre at the Centre for Alternative Technology, and you can see Sebastian here demonstrating these points coming live. So when people record it in the field, they appear live on the screen, they appear live on my computer, and they're downloadable, so students can use them and all sorts, so anybody can use those points. We also have the equivalent happening in the Old College in 2023, where there'll be connection with CAT, so people will be able to go through and they can see all the maps for Wales, all the other things as well. So linked with biodiversity, we're encouraging concurrent recording of land cover, habitat, and biodiversity. We think it's sort of essential, if not, it's desirable, but it's really essential now. And what we want to do is sort of say, well, if you see, say, a long-eared owl, where did you see it? And so rather than just saying that's what I've seen it, it's actually telling you I've seen it here. And the idea behind the app is that if we can use it to improve the land cover maps, maybe you don't need to record habitat much into the future because the maps have improved to the point where you've just got that reference information there anyway in order to change. There's also this increasing requirement to understand and quantify how change impacts and pressures. They affect the distribution of balance and diversity of flora and fauna, and also quantifying the recovery of biodiversity as habitats are restored. So we've got lots of people who are trying to restore habitats. You could sort of, link it and say, how am I doing? What wildlife is coming back, and is it growing well? Or is a fire coming and destroy the recovery process? So, and it's just both flora and fauna. So I put Atlantic oak forests in here, for example. So, where are they? How are they doing? And so on. So you do all sorts of things that link in with fauna and flora and biodiversity. And finally, the idea is to have land cover and change. That's what we do. We link that to habitats up here. The change is based on impacts and pressures, which leads into the drivers, pressures, states, impacts, and response framework, which is a policy framework, with the response being things like restoration or prevention of flooding and so on. But that link with biodiversity, that's the key bit. We really would love these maps to be used to help restore biodiversity and so on. Lots of users, we've set up in that chapter some examples of users, like land managers. The idea is, we're experts, we like to move it into the citizen science field more. And that helps us validate not only the environmental descriptors like canopy cover and so on, but also the map as a whole, so the land cover maps and the elements that feed into that. But all of those elements feed into species distribution models, which can help you then to sort of, look at, where woodpeckers or long-eared owls might be. And also, you can predict all these descriptors like canopy cover from models. And so it gives you an idea of, what your target might be and how you can monitor progress towards it. Our maps, this is our global biomass map of forest biomass with ESA, and that is linked into Wales now. So we're validating that. So we've got biomass as well. Any variable can go into the maps, but that feeds into our global climate change models. The Living Wales, the points go into global land cover maps from ESA, which also feed into climate models. So all those points are being used to support climate modelling and predicting what will happen in the future, which effectively is the pressures that are causing the changes. So that's really important. And also then we've got, biodiversity links into, distributions of where animals and plants are, where they could be, the climate and sustainability, the Sustainable Development Goals. So it all feeds in. So in effect, what we're saying is that every point you collect, every time you press canopy cover, you're feeding into the global climate and the global biodiversity and sustainable development, restoration agenda. And I think that's really valuable for people to realise they can do something about things. So I'll stop there, and hopefully that is okay, Izzy.
Thank you, Richard. We're slightly beyond time now, but that was a really interesting presentation. And I think, what we're all seeing is the real potential of using these data together and the exciting approaches that can be there. But, obviously we need to think about how do we make this all work. So we do now have time for questions. I'm going to let it run on a little bit. I think we'll catch up later on. Izzy, I see you're supposed to be chairing the questions, but there might be questions coming to you as well. So I'm going to hand over to you, Izzy, and I hope you can cope with doing both jobs.
Hopefully, yeah, perfect. Yeah, if anyone has any questions for Ailey, myself, or Richard, I know Richard might need to run off in 5 minutes, but yeah, if you could put them in the chat or pop your hand up, then we're more than happy to take them. No questions at all. We just did everything so well. It was, oh, there we go. David.
Hi, hi. I just had a question, and it's sort of linked to your very last point that every data point counts. in biodiversity monitoring schemes, at least most of them, we're often very concerned about bias, uncertainty, representativeness, and so on. And for the unstructured schemes, we have to deal with that. And I just wondered about your thoughts on that, because your aims are about ground truthing. Your map, you mentioned ground truthing, and you've got this Sentinel data, which is very comprehensive, I assume, but the ground truthing might be biased or localized or certain habitat bias. So I just wondered how you dealt with that you might get sort of uneven contributions in different areas of your map, basically.
I think you definitely will do that, and I think that's at the moment, because it was a trial, an experimental phase in that, the one that you see at the minute. So I think having more people from a diverse range of backgrounds recording information, and what they're doing is they're validating the different components. It's a very structured system, the LCCS. So you will get biases towards certain environments, but then we also have plans or capacity to maybe direct particular campaigns to certain things, or to try and cover all of Wales. So I think what's happened in the past is that, first of all, there's been no data available. The second thing is that often it's been just for, say, the Gower. And yet what we're trying to do is say, well, we want a national picture, a national map, and something that's globally applicable. So I think we're trying to get sort of by extensive coverage by different users. We're sort of covering the main range, because some people will be visiting water areas, some will be visiting salt marshes, for example. So the wider it's used, the better. I think definitely confirmation of the quality of the data is something we need to look at, and I think that's one of the things we'd really like to get from the workshop is are there ideas that we can help to make this the collection, or the way that we're developing this or designing it, because we're still in the design phase, to sort of overcome some of those issues. And so any of your experience on that would be really helpful. But we're sort of going for diversity of habitats, because the app is sort of lends itself to that, but also just different people in there who have different skills, but it basically makes it very consistent. I think the whole approach is very consistent for Wales, but also globally, because the same thing works anywhere in the world. In Australia it works, in Malaysia we've tried it, and it's very consistent, and that consistency is really important. But we'd love to have your feedback on that as well.
Okay, thank you.
Brilliant, thanks Richard. David, Roy, you've got your hand up.
I almost came in when you said David. Too many Davids. I guess it's quite related to David Noble's question, really, was around, I sort of assume that the relationship between, or the training of the algorithms for the land cover classification is presumably quite good in certain habitats and poor in others. So I was wondering if there's any way of expressing the uncertainty in your land cover predictions through map interfaces that then you could potentially direct volunteer effort to where it's going to add most value, where you've got most uncertainty, whether that's a sort of concept that's being thought of around Living Wales or other EO products. Yeah,
so every layer that's either like canopy cover or biomass or so on has got an input to it. So it's got an algorithm or whatever, and then we sort of validate that algorithm, maybe with physical measures for continuous variables like water turbidity, or leaf type is a categorical measure. So there's two types, continuous and categorical. So each of those, there's various ways of validating that as well. But I think what happens then is when you combine them together, when you get a tall, closed, broadleaf evergreen forest dominated by oak, the oak has an accuracy, the leaf type has an accuracy, the phenology has an accuracy. They've all got different accuracies, and that's where you can say, well, this isn't very good. Like, we know the canopy cover isn't brilliant, so we can then direct effort towards improving the canopy cover layer, which improves everything else you see. So it just helps improve the algorithms, the machine learning algorithms, and then the more people contribute, the better the maps will be. And I'll get Savannah to put the papers into the chat, because I'll have to leave to lecture now, unfortunately. But there's two papers on crops, for example, and there's one on the leaf type, larch forest, that Savannah's done. There's a couple from the Australian side where we've validated things over there. So, you know, the idea is to publish everything, make it open so people can use it, and all the maps and the change, you know, that you can see those. And what it is, it's trying to get this contribution to those maps by people who feel that they are making a difference in making those maps better. And of course, if the better the maps, the more informed the decisions. Does that help? So yes, that'd be good. I must lecture now. I'm going to leave it with Savannah and Sebastian and Clive, and then thank you very much. And I'll try and join later on for the discussion as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Richard. Ruth?
Hello. Yeah, I suppose I had a question that was a bit more taking a step back, because obviously I'd seen the advertisement of this as getting citizen scientists into habitat recording. And obviously this very much concentrates on getting citizen scientists to validate Earth observation. And my feeling is that citizen science habitat recording doesn't have to be just about that. There's loads of other recording that is going on that is of value for habitat. And I wondered, I just didn't want all that to be missed by concentrating on the Earth observation kind of side of things. And I suppose I also felt it was a bit strange that we were coming at this from the presumption that we were taking species recorders and trying to get them to become habitat recorders, and that they would find this difficult and be unmotivated to do so. When what we found, particularly with looking at features of things, that often volunteers find it an awful lot easier. So things like where we've given people water quality testing kits, or whether they're trying to identify a barrier on a river or something, they find that really easy, much easier than they do to be able to identify species. So I didn't want, I felt there was a bit of presumption in there that we were asking them to do something quite difficult or something that they would be unmotivated to do. And I felt that seemed to be coming from this kind of assumption that we were going to get species recorders to validate Earth observation stuff, when actually there's a whole lot of other habitat recording that's useful in its own right, and maybe coming from a different perspective.
Definitely, no, that's a fantastic point. Thank you, Ruth. I think, yeah, we're very aware of the fact that validating Earth observation and habitat classification is a tiny element of all of the habitat features that you've mentioned are far more important and far more informative in many cases, and as you say, far more interesting for people to actually look at. And things like that's why we'd be interested in getting people's perceptions on if they're interested in things like evidence of management or that kind of, so you get a really rounded, full holistic picture of habitat rather than putting it in a box type thing. I think that's just one element of habitat recording, as you mentioned. So hopefully, and things like, as Richard Lucas mentioned, the idea of almost kind of modules of different recording apps so that you can focus on different things of interest. Hopefully things like that would make that possible in future.
Thanks to everybody for their comments and participation, and we'll see you again soon.